Hello, everybody. Hello. Welcome. Welcome to Nottingham Contemporary. My name's Emma Moore. I'm the Assistant Curator for the public programme here. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you all to InDialogue 2014. And it's quite exciting for us to be launching what promises to be a very stimulating weekend of discussion and performance and lots of conversations and, of course, food and drink as well. So, yeah, looking forward to how the event unfolds over the course of the next few days. It's also exciting for us because we hosted the first InDialogue in 2012, and it's interesting to see how the ambition of the curators, but also those that are participating, has grown over the past 2 years. So yes, thank you all very much for coming, and I'll hand you over to the InDialogue team, Rhiannon Jones and Heather Connolly, who are the founding members of InDialogue, and Rebecca Beinart, who's a guest curator for InDialogue 2014, and they'll talk a little bit about the programme and what's going to happen over the next few days before a conversation with Grant Kester, which is very exciting. So enjoy. Thank you.
Hello, and thanks Emma, and thanks for Nottingham Contemporary for putting this on, and we will thank the other venues as well as we go on. So, good evening and welcome to InDialogue 2014. We're just really delighted that you could come here and that you applied to participate, because it's really exciting, and yes, we've kind of got more people that want to come than we've got tickets and space, and so yes, it's really, really thrilling.
Yeah, so hello everybody as well who's watching online. We know that there's quite a few people watching from various countries, so hello to you guys as well. It's a pleasure to have everybody here in the room with us, and especially for those that have travelled so far. I know Howard's literally just got off a plane and taken a seat. Welcome. It's wonderful to have such a variety of artists, researchers, curators, performance makers here with us. And we're grateful, ever so grateful, to Nottingham Contemporary and to Emma and Jim for your hard work helping us, to Primary and to Backlit and to Dance 4, for supporting the event, and loads of other individuals which we will name and shame you all throughout the weekend. Having diverse sites has been really important to us, and it was an ambition that we set out when we first started discussing the idea of the symposium, how we could host speakers, panels, performances and presentations that would respond to the site rather than work in and having to be shoehorned into a particular space. So why are we here?
Well, the first event in 2012 was born out of a conversation whilst we were on a walk in the Peak District in Derbyshire in 2011. And it was a spin-off from a New Research Trajectories, which was an AHRC-funded network for PGR students that I founded, and Rebecca's here as well, who we started off this, I suppose, walk together. And so I met Rhiannon, I didn't know her before, and we started talking, and we started to realise that we had an interest, and that was about dialogue, that both of us were kind of doing PhD, but we're using art practice, and we were both interested in dialogue, but from very different perspectives, and that will become apparent throughout the symposium. And I think that's one of the strengths, really, that we're kind of looking at it from very different points of view. Anyway, we found a common interest, and we were interested in how other people might interpret or use the term and the practice of dialogue. So we set this up. And we were also interested in how research can be disseminated, and so we really wanted to challenge that, the traditional conference. Even though you're all sat here in rows, we've made a decision not to use the tiered seating. We want people to move around. We want people to dialogue with the spaces. We want people to kind of interact with each other and so forth. And so there's different types of knowledge. It's not just written knowledge. It's not just, I don't know, it's people are going to be doing things about touch, etc. So I think that's really important. It's something that we kind of really set out, that we wanted to explore and see if anybody else was interested, and obviously you are, which is fantastic. Okay. Sorry, let's see if that. So, yes, I think, again, another thing was that we were all presenting, we were all artists, we were all doing research, we were all in institutions, and when we were presenting at conferences, we found there wasn't really the space to be experimental, to test ideas out as much as we'd like to, and as we would do as practicing artists normally. And so again, that's something that we've tried to allow people to do, and I know a few people are using the conference to test things out, and that's exactly what we wanted it to happen. And also the other thing was that the interesting things that happened during conferences we noted were over dinner. They were in the breaks. They were all of those things. and again, we wanted to try and create an event that would be central in lots of ways, which is why we have arranged to have dinner and lunch and so forth, just so that you're all together. And over the we've got 4 days. Last time it was 2 days. Is that you build that dialogue over that period of time. And I'm still in touch with people I met. 2012, I've been working with them, etc. So I hope you will all do that as well. Anyway, I've gone off the script now.
That's cool, we like that. So InDialogue, just for a bit of background, it was set up, really, the words we used were to enable cross-pollination between different institutions, contexts and cultures, to interrogate dialogic practices through dialogue and exchange amongst established and early career academics, artists, researchers and interested parties. It's now become a branded research symposium and is a biannual event. Each time we invite a guest curator who has an interest in dialogic practice to work alongside us, and we were absolutely delighted that Becky agreed to work with the pair of us. I hope it's not been too painful. So most of you are aware that this is the second InDialogue, and the first one took just two years ago. We received proposals then from around the world, including Canada, the USA, Greece, Italy, Germany and France. We were quite taken aback by its reach. The event featured performances, workshops and presentations over the 2 days with international artists presenting in person or on Skype from Palestine, Serbia, Rotterdam, California, Vienna. And in addition, the presenters and participants who also attended the event, we had here live with us just over 65 people, and then we had 80 people a day watching online. So we had a wide reach, and we realised that we probably would do it again. So to the present day, we've tried to maintain a unique design for the symposium, and by that we mean that it takes place across a city and is now using 3 distinct arts venues. So over the next 3 days here, there's going to be installations, presentations, performances, workshops, meals, panel discussions, performers, collectives, curators, researchers, academics. And the countries that we've got in this room are from UK, Italy, Peru, USA, Germany, Czech Republic, Colombia, Brazil, Portugal, and Finland. So hello. Yes.
Hello. So yes, we invited Rebecca to join us and to keep the programming and the selection process fresh. So our research interests, you'll find, are reflected in the curation of the event and the programming design and the papers that we selected. We are thrilled that you're all here and looking forward to what's going to happen and unfold over the next few days. And we look forward to eating, drinking with you all later and over the next few days to digest, disseminate and converse. We're all here to engage in with it dialogue, to have conversations, to rewrite, to edit, to mute, to watch, to listen, to question, to respond and to participate. So we've got 3 research interests which frame the programme. So we're just going to give you a brief kind of introduction to that to help frame this event. So I'm going to be doing the first panel, and my interest, or the panel's entitled Linguistic Hospitality. And I'm going to have Fucking Good Art, Rachel Marsden with me to discuss their work and their practices. And just a little brief introduction to myself. I've just finished my doctorate. Yay! And which I did at Loughborough University, and so it was by fine art practice. I'm an associate lecturer at De Montfort University and Loughborough University, and I've got a studio at Backlit. My research is concerned with art and linguistic translation and translation as dialogue. And as a monolingual speaker, in order to research that and to make work about translation, I have to seek out multilingual speakers to work with. So I work collaboratively. And most recently, I've been working with a French-Canadian artist and a French artist who speaks Icelandic, and working on Skype, which we're kind of hoping will work tonight. And so just trying to, my practice is really it tries to create translation zones, so bringing people together from different backgrounds, cultures and disciplines to discuss art and translation. And I'm also really interested in how art practice can be used to contribute to knowledge in its own and in other disciplines. So I'm always in dialogue in one way or another. So I've invited Robert Heimlich, I hope I'm saying that right, Ninka Terpsner, who presented at InDialogue 2012. Sorry, it doesn't go back that long. And they were on somebody else's panel last time, and I met them, and I've been in touch with them, and they've contributed to my thesis, and so it's just going to be great to talk with them again. And Rachel Marsden, who's going to be on my panel as well, is a curator, and she works in China, and she attempts to challenge the stereotypical models of contemporary Asian art that so often appears in Western galleries. So I'm just really excited that I could do that.
Panel 2, so how my research kind of frames the symposium, is around the performative nature of conversation. And I'm delighted that I have persuaded John, I can't see where you are, John. John, there he is, hello, to kindly be in conversation with me tomorrow afternoon. So I'm Rhiannon, as you probably are aware now. I'm an artist in residence at Primary Studios. I supervise on the MA Fine Art at NTU, whilst I'm also attempting to finish the PhD, which is entitled The Artistry of Conversation. It's by practice as a research inquiry, and my concern really is around the aesthetics of experience to challenge conventional perceptions and systems of knowledge. I'm interested in the distinctions between conversation and dialogue, both in terminology and as a method for practice. So John, I pre-warned him I was going to say this. He really, for me, is the godfather of dialogue. He's an internationally acclaimed artist with a beautiful and distinctive practice and a dear friend. And Grant Kester, hopefully, will be joining us on Skype very shortly. He's Professor of Art History and Chair of Visual Arts at the University of California in San Diego, and author of Conversation Pieces, and most recently, The One and the Many. Rather poignantly, Grant Kester said that conversation is ongoing and decrees his book, Conversation Pieces, as a gift. And this symposium is really a direct outcome of reading those pages that he wrote that were so fresh, particularly in my mind, when Heather and I started talking in 2011, and how that conversation should continue and it should be ongoing. And we're thrilled that hopefully we'll be talking to him later.
Sounds like he might be there. Hi everyone, I'm Rebecca, and I am an artist. I'm not attached to any academic institution, but since January this year I've been working as the engagement curator at Primary, which is the studios and one of the venues that's hosting InDialogue this year, and also was part of 2012. So it's kind of new to me to be attached to an institution, even though it's a small institution. And it's raised, the job that I'm doing, kind of in addition to my own practice, has raised questions, or kind of made me want to ask particular questions at this InDialogue. So I was involved in InDialogue 2012 as one of the presenters, and then I was delighted when Heather and Rhiannon invited me to join the team as a guest curator for this year's event. The questions and conversations I want to bring into the symposium are around the politics of participation and about agency and power in relation to dialogue, participatory art, and artists working in the public realm. I'm interested in the agendas behind these ways of working, for artists, for their collaborators, for institutions, and for funders, and whether dialogue necessarily affects change, and if so, for whom. So I'm going to be exploring those questions through a panel discussion with Jana Graham and Lorena Rivera de Beer, who are going to be joining us on Saturday. And very unfortunately, Gary Anderson, who is the third panellist for that conversation, is, due to personal circumstances, unable to join us. So through that panel discussion and also through many of the other presentations and performances and conversations that we've kind of programmed and that you're offering through the event, I hope to delve into some of these issues and also to hopefully be changed by the conversations we have.
Wow. So what we've tried to do is use our 3 distinct research areas of interest to kind of frame the symposium, and we feel that they're very current and important areas of research that's reflected also in the conversations we've been having with one another when we were also looking at the applications and then the selections that we made for this year's InDialogue. And that's kind of taken place alongside us then talking about how to do lanyards, print on A3 paper, how many cups we've got, whether we've ordered enough samosas, and whether there's enough bottles of wine for the welcome tonight.
Yeah, and we're thrilled this year that Gillian Whiteley will be chairing the symposium. She can't be here tonight, but she will introduce to everyone tomorrow. Online? She is watching online. Hi, Jill. Oops. Gillian Whiteley has been a colleague of mine for many years, and she's based at the School of the Arts at Loughborough University. And there she's the leader of the Politicised Practice Research Group and co-organiser of Radical Aesthetics, Radical Art with Jane Tormey. And she's also an editor, and she's also lots more than that, really. I can't really do her justice. Aside from this, she's been a great support of her InDialogue and was on the research committee that funded the first event. And Gillian's knowledge, writing and interests are wide-ranging and eclectic, which is why we've asked her to be the chair. She wrote about a collaboration that I did in 2007 with 2 other artists in America, and it's just great that she can be involved and the dialogue can be ongoing, and we're so honoured that she's agreed to do this for us.
And then one more person we wanted to introduce to you, who's going to be with us throughout the symposium, is Michael Pinchbeck, who I believe is lurking back there. He's been invited to observe and gather information during the event and to offer a creative response and facilitate discussion with InDialogue 2014 participants on Sunday morning. So for those of you who are staying for the duration, that will be the opportunity to kind of see what Michael has gathered and also be a part of that discussion. So just a bit about Michael. He's a writer, live artist and theatre maker based here in Nottingham. He lectures in drama at the University of Lincoln. He has an MA in performance and live art from Nottingham Trent University and is currently pursuing a PhD at Loughborough University, exploring the role of the dramaturg in contemporary performance. He's written for Contemporary Theatre Review, Dance Theatre Journal and studies in theatre and performance. So thanks very much, Michael, for agreeing to do this for us.
It's you, baby.
Oh, sorry, misreading my script. We'd like to say a massive thank you to all of you who've come here to present your work and for your generosity in being part of this event, and also to everyone else who's chosen to come and take part. We'd like to thank all the volunteers who are helping out and who are helping to make the event possible. They've been absolutely brilliant. And I'd also like to thank Rhiannon and Heather for bringing me along for the adventure.
I hope it's a good one. As Grant is now online, I think we'll kind of go straight to talking to Grant. Grant Kester is Professor of Art History and Chair of Visual Arts at the University of California, San Diego. He's published what I consider to be many essential and prolific titles that have been read internationally by artists and researchers alike. His book, Conversation Pieces, I really think is a toolkit for practitioners interested in dialogue, and I'm delighted that he can join us. When I first spoke to Grant, we talked about his latest book and the notions around collaboration and collective art practices and how they've proliferated around the world in the last 15 years. And in The One and the Many, Grant Kester has provided an overview of the broader continuum of collaborative art ranging from work by groups of artists widely celebrated in mainstream practices to less publicised projects such as Park Fiction in Hamburg. The idea of his definition of cooperation, how we can build platforms of communication and exchange, is to say but a few words about the depth in which he writes so beautifully. The structure for the conversation now is we've agreed to have a 15-minute conversation with one another and then to open it up to the floor for the following 15 minutes where you can really be in conversation with Grant. Does that sound okay to you, Grant, and what we agreed?
Sure, that sounds fine.
Okay, great. So, I would like, as a starting point, Grant, to ask you, please, to give me your personal definition for 2 words. I would like you to tell me what you currently think collaboration is and what agency is.
Okay, let me respond to that. Is my sound all right?
We can hear you.
Great. And if I go on too long, raise a hand or give me a yell, and I'll rein myself in a little bit, because this is a big question, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, how do we understand collaboration? And so I want to first say that I feel that the idea of collaboration it's not for me an anomaly in the history, kind of long history of modernism. It's really very central to the history of art, not just contemporary art, but more generally. And for me, I can try to briefly summarize why I think that's the case. I would argue that in fact, in its totality, going back really 2 centuries, that the emergence of modern art is about questions of how we relate to others. And when I say how we relate to others in terms of, say, aesthetic philosophy or aesthetic theory, we have a moment around the late 18th century, the early 18th century, in the development of, say, the work of Kant or Schiller, a period during which a lot of the existing forms of external control that had been used to enforce norms and behaviors and so on, by which I mean absolutist religious or political authority, were in decline. And at the same time, you have a kind of fragmenting force, which is the experience of nascent capitalism. And so what gets set in place then is a search for some kind of new foundation that we could rely on or turn to that would provide us with a basis to connect to each other. If we're no longer forced to behave in a way, that is, if we're no longer forced to overcome the kind of Hobbesian experience of being violent to each other by an external force, then we have to discover that new principle inside ourselves, some very deep subjective space. It needs to be opened up, needs to be excavated, right? And that's what aesthetic philosophy ends up doing. It becomes a way to either discover or implant a capacity to be open to others different from ourselves. And so that's, for me, that's how I interpret the sensus communis in Kant, the idea that if we engage in a kind of a disinterested experience of the world, an aesthetic experience of the world, where we're not trying to control things, we access a capacity, a piece of our cognitive apparatus that's universal. We see it in Schiller's concept of aesthetic education, the idea that the role of art should be to humanize and the aristocrats and to civilize the rabble in some way, to bring them together. Over and over again, we see in the history of art a concern with self-other relationships. But the way that those are constructed in the early stages of modernity is through a kind of system which suggests that the only way art can perform this function is through a kind of displacement or deferral, a separation in which we're dealing with the subject as an individual. That is, that the most essential form of our identity is as an individual. That there is a kind of a monadic self, right, that exists prior to any intersubjective or social experience. And that's where art works. That's where art lives. That's what art operates on. And that's where we get the kind of characteristic displacements that we see in modernism, in modernist art and aesthetics. And there's a displacement and a deferral, I said. By deferral, I mean a kind of a constant sense in aesthetics and in art practice that the actual viewer, the person who's going to really benefit from your work, from an aesthetic encounter, doesn't yet exist. Either they're a kind of a hypothetical individual who you interpolate with your work, or they literally don't exist historically. They have not come into existence yet. We see that with the work of somebody like Adorno very clearly, this idea that the work of art is a kind of an Alexandrian library that holds on to this revolutionary impulse that the working class has abrogated in some way, that art holds in trust certain capacities, certain values, certain beliefs that can't yet be actualized in the quote-unquote real world. So we have a kind of a temporal deferral, that is, we have to wait before the aesthetic utopia of being good to others can come into existence, or we have a spatial displacement in which that can only be acted out in a kind of a virtual or symbolic realm, that is the space of the gallery or the museum, which are simply architectural forms for an ideological division, which is that you cannot expect to produce this kind of relationship to otherness in quote-unquote real practical circumstances. It can only be done at the symbolic level through the surrogate of an artwork that stands in for an actual other living person. Now that's a very, very, I apologize for how condensed that is, but for me that's a way to kind of map out how self-other, and for me self-other is central to collaboration and to collaborative practice, how that gets mapped out through the history of modernism. And what I want to argue here is to simply say that with the dematerialization of works of art beginning in the 1960s, a different trajectory, a different space is opened up. And this is the space in which the deferral and the displacement, that is the temporal deferral, the tendency of works of art to always be addressing a viewer that's not actually present in the gallery, but is the kind of fictive reconstruction of the artist's mind, or this displacement where we cannot expect to produce new generative insight, where we cannot expect to produce empathetic understanding in an actual working context. Those both get kind of destabilized. They get challenged in certain ways. I've talked about this elsewhere as a kind of a renegotiation of aesthetic autonomy. And it's taken a few decades, my feeling is it's taken a few decades for the kind of more radical, challenging nature of that dematerialization to emerge. What, as an artist, how do you produce? And let me step back and say, this distancing that we see in displacement and deferral is essential. It's important. It's how one gains a critical purchase on the totality of a current social situation, right? There's a criticality that's essential to understanding the aesthetic. So if you're no longer making objects and putting them in galleries, that is if the criticality is no longer being produced in a way by this form of spatial and temporal displacement that we associate with conventional artistic practices, how do artistic practices go about producing this shift in consciousness that is essential to what we do as artists? And so this is really the question that concerns me, is how does collaborative practice reconstruct a concept of criticality without relying on the object as a surrogate for another person, and without relying on the idea that you have to act these things out in symbolic contexts. All of those ideas suggest a kind of firewall between the symbolic and the practical. And this is what I think is breaking down with collaborative practice, is a recognition that it's possible to both work in a quasi-instrumental way, that is in a context of practice, of resistance, and so on, while not abandoning the capacity to step back to achieve a kind of an aesthetic separation that becomes a kind of critical separation, reflection on what that practice is about. And for me, that's the most the strongest collaborative practices are the ones that are able to work at that boundary line between instrumentality and a kind of, we might say, a kind of an imaginary and projective or speculative form of thought that becomes critical in some ways. So now, should I stop? Have I gone on too long?
I'm desperate to ask you something, Grant. Going back to when you talk about the other and how we understand the other, I mean, what I really feel, certainly in regards to my own research and to reading yours, it's that notion of extending a discourse for a dialogical practice, which is moving away from a linear ideology towards a definition where we encourage pluralism, participation, aesthetic experiences, where we try to, I guess, dare I use that word, transform human consciousness through dialogue. And you're nodding, that's good, we agree. But I guess my question to you then is, when you talk about the other as it's how we separate ourselves from other, and that ultimately that space between self and other is unpredictable. It requires relationships. It requires sometimes the generation of a new sense of self. And ultimately, it's about a generation of new knowledge. So how does that then fit in with placing the word collaboration against the word agency?
Okay, so that's a really good question. And let me contextualize it by saying that one of the things that I think is distinct about the contemporary moment, and it's one of the things that attracts me to the work of somebody like Mikhail Bakhtin or even George Herbert Mead, and that is so much of our pre-existing ideas in art continue to be rooted in this notion that the kind of most basic form of a self is a pre-social self, right? Whether you're talking about, Lacan's mirror stage, or you're talking about Schiller or Kant, in the broad sweep of kind of critical theory as it's read in the art context, there is still a strong investment in the monadic pre-social self as the site at which real work needs to be done, this transformative work that you're describing. And that once that work's been done, once we've learned to accept the fact that we're defined by a fundamental ontological gap or absence in Lacan, once we've learned to humanize our perceptions of difference in Lyotard or Schiller, then we can have experiences with others. Then we can exercise agency in the world. And what Bakhtin and Mead argue is that there is no self outside of these intersubjective relationships, that the self is literally formed intersubjectively. And it sounds like a kind of a simple or maybe kind of, a peculiar philosophical distinction, but I think it's really profound because it changes, at least for me, the perception of what happens when you relate to other people and the forms of agency that can be mobilized. You don't have to, in other words, fix the individual subject, and then they're allowed to kind of go into the world and have these encounters. It provides a level of understanding of how transformative the self-other encounter can be, how creative, how generative it can be. That is very alien to us, I think, in an art context. So for me, agency can be understood both in this, I suppose, a kind of an ontological sense, that is that in a collaborative practice, there's a renegotiation of the contours of the self that goes on, that's changing your sense of who you are. This is what Bakhtin calls answerability. What does it mean to work with somebody and instead of in a kind of a Santiago Sierra way, imagining who comes in the gallery, oh, they're going to all of a sudden discover that capitalism is evil, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of imaginary subject. What does it mean to work with an answerable other? That is somebody that's actually there in the full concrete nature of their individuality at multiple levels and that acts as a real interlocutor. How does that change agency and how does that change aesthetic or critical experience? So I think that's an important thing to mention in terms of rethinking agency, because the notion of agency changes quite dramatically if you think about it in those terms. And then the second point I want to make, and again, I don't want to go on too long because I get kind of enthusiastic when I'm talking about these things and I'll ramble on. The second thing about agency that I want to say is I feel that discussions of agency have kind of there's a certain stasis in contemporary critical readings of these issues, and there's a few things to point to that I think might help to open up the debate. The first thing I want to say is that if we're going to start to answer some of these questions about, for example, the vicissitudes of agency and creative practice, we need new theoretical paradigms. And we don't really, and this is really where art history and theory has failed profoundly in terms of this area of practice. I think that the new understandings of, say, the creative nature of agency or the creative nature of a collaborative practice have to evolve out of a study of the practice itself. And this is something that I've been interested in recently, which is what are the proper methodologies for understanding this work? Where do we look for the theoretical toolkit to develop an understanding of this work? And as I said, I feel like that's going to have to come out of a new understanding of what the practice does. I want to just identify three blockages or aporias that I think I just put on the table as things to be reconsidered. And I find these over and over again in terms of readings of contemporary collaborative art. And the first one is the division between the ethical and the aesthetic.
I was just going to ask you about that.
Yeah, which is a very common, you're using ethical criteria, not aesthetic criteria. And for me, you can really only sustain that argument if you completely ignore the fact that at the very core of modernist art and aesthetics is an ethical imperative, right? That is its function ideologically within bourgeois culture, is to carry an ethical meaning of some kind.
Can I just add to that as well, Grant, please? Because this is something that I'd like, when we open to the floor, I'd really like us to maybe start to think about this and have a discussion over the weekend about it, is where that ethical and epistemological kind of effect on collaboration and interaction happens. Because one of the things I think we're both agreed on is that the theoretical inquiry into self and other is very established, yet the idea of temporal, that's still very problematic, and the nature around that, I think, is less explored, less written about, and less understood and digested. So I think that has to come back into that point you're making about the ethical and the aesthetic.
When you say temporal, what do you have in mind?
Well, the temporal nature of those moments when you encounter between self and other, or the temporal moments of collaboration. So, for example, we've got artists here that are coming together in the city to make works as part of InDialogue, who are bringing works to explore through workshops with other researchers and artists from different countries. So you have those temporal encounters which are very significant, which affect those artists and researchers, hopefully for the best. But that isn't necessarily as understood or as considered as the theoretical inquiry around dialogue is.
That makes a lot of sense, Rhiannon. And it's actually one of my other three kind of aporias or blockages or blind spots. The first one is ethics and aesthetics, and in particular, this kind of getting very hung up on where's the aesthetic and then associating aesthetics with form somehow or the way a thing looks, which is for me, it's a very conservative understanding, and I think it's necessary to really think of aesthetics in the long sweep, to understand it as a form of bodily or haptic knowledge that produces certain forms of information, certain forms of insight, and so on. And if you kind of unclench yourself from this very traditional notion of aesthetics, it's easier to see how problematic that opposition can be. To go to your point, in terms of the temporality, the second, am I going on too long? Should I stop?
No, you're fine. I'm just teeing up the mic because I think we can open it to the floor shortly.
I'll make this the last two really quick. The second one is this problematic division between projects that are based on consensus and agonistic conflict. And again, this is part of the synchronic bias of a lot of contemporary art theory, which treats the experience of a work of art is a kind of a cut. If we take a cut out of the experience at a particular moment in time and analyze what's going on at that particular moment, in fact, these practices unfold diachronically over time, and through that unfolding, there are going to be moments or periods of conflict, of resistance, of rupture. There are going to be moments of conciliation, and they're going to fluctuate, right, dynamically, moving back and forth. So again, I often will read these and I want to make a work of art that's agonistic and not, it's not based on fake ideas of community and so on. Well, again, to me, that's a temporal question. all right, in terms of dealing with the work in its totality over time. And then the third one goes back to this question of agency. And just briefly, it's the tendency to believe you either, if you question the sovereign agency of the artist in some way, that is, if you say, I'm invested in collaborative practices that are horizontal, then you're somehow entirely emptying out the idea of authorial agency in the work. And in fact, I would argue that it's simply a question of thematizing agency or authorship, rather than abandoning it per se, but making agency or authorship itself a site of creative engagement. So I feel like that a lot of the theoretical and critical discussion has been arrested a little bit because we keep bumping up against these binary oppositions, which for me are really problematic and limiting. Okay, I'm going to stop with that now.
So who would like to make a response to Grant on that point? Or there are other words I've scrawled down here, like notions of bodily and haptic knowledge, consensus, conflict, flux, moments of flux. So would anybody like to respond to what Grant was just saying, or respond to any of the other points that he's raised? Come on, we've got to talk to one another all weekend. Heather, do you have a question? Becky, come on.
Hi, Grant.
Hi.
I think it's really interesting. I mean, you've covered so much within a short period of time, and it's ringing lots of bells in my head. I'm really interested as well in terms of how you're positioning it in terms of art history, and how that's a blockage in some way. And it's kind of starting to make things sink in a little bit with certain situations, and I think maybe that's where the artist's knowledge and the artist pushing research is at the forefront. Because yes, we understand art history and we're kind of knowledgeable about that, but we're actually doing the stuff, and there's something about doing that's really important, and dialogue as a process. And I think what Rhiannon said, it's interesting, we all talk about the symposium or ideas, but we don't actually get to talk about our research together at all. And so it's really interesting starting to join those dots up there, and actually the role of dialogue, and also this idea as a academic or a researcher, you should be this lone wolf, you know, and that kind of idea of cross-pollination, transdisciplinary, you know, working collaboratively with others. It's not always valued as much as it could be within HE, so higher education here in the UK. I'm not sure how it is in America, but I think, you know, that for me, just that process and valuing that process, whatever that process is I think what the Dialogic Conference or what we do, you know. Anyway, I don't know where I'm going with that, but thank you.
Yeah, I also wonder, currency, that's something, you know, the value and currency of artists that are practicing, and researchers that are researching through practice as well. And we have that debate all the time about where the value lies, whether you're one or the other or both, and how those relationships sit with institutions and city and public art. And I know that's something you're nodding, you write a lot and reflect a lot on that. Does anyone have any questions or reflections? John, I'm hovering near you, to do with currency and value, and I know you use that a lot in your work. Is there anybody else who would like to ask Grant a question? Yeah. Can you just introduce yourself to him, please?
Hi, Grant. My name is Rochelle Viade-Knowles. I lead the area of fine art at Coventry University here in the UK. I'm very interested in the way you were talking through these different kind of blockages, as you put them, in terms of these ways in which we're starting to sort of unpack these dialogue-based art practices. And I apologise if the question I'm about to ask is well-trodden territory, but it would be interesting for me to, very particularly because we're having this conversation through Skype, to ask you about what I see as a kind of a blockage between participatory practices that happen face-to-face versus participatory practices that happen through these kinds of mediated technologies, particularly because one of the organisers was talking about the kind of, you know, the politics around these things, and I work collaboratively with people in other countries who have difficulty getting visas, and so this idea of being face-to-face is obviously obviously really problematic. And so to me, it's a really kind of, sort of a critique-laden practice to try and work with these kinds of technologies, because our day-to-day lives are littered with moving back and forth between these kinds of encounters and face-to-face kinds of encounters. But I notice this real tendency that sort of continues to sort of divide these ways of participatory conversations into two different sorts of camps. So I'm just wondering if you might sort of address that blockage.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, there is a whole I don't know if I'd say completely independent, but you know, there's a whole set of debates about social interaction, mediated online social interaction, forms of participation online, forms of labor, online labor, forms of participation that get monetized through online labor. That's really not so connected, I suppose, to the kind of things that I write about. I'm kind of aware of those debates and those dialogues, but I don't really take them on board so much. And I think about like the last book I did. I don't really write on projects that are online, digital, you know, mediated through some form of virtual technology. You know, and it's not because I don't think that they're not valid or interesting at all. It has emerged, I think, as a slightly separate, you know, like as a slightly separate world, though, which is really interesting. For myself, you know, if what I'm after is to, and I guess this is like what's driven a lot of my research for a long time, which is to kind of get at the micro level of what happens in the relationship between self and other in forms of difference. The human subject is incredibly complex psychically and emotionally and physically, all the levels on which we communicate, not just obviously verbally, and the bandwidth reduction that occurs when I'm talking to you from San Diego and I see a little picture on my screen and I'm not physically present there, it's pretty profound, right? I mean, you know, there's a lot of data that can't be communicated between the two of us because of that mediation. And I guess I've been more drawn to the kind of context-rich exchanges that occur in the face-to-face. But as you said, you can't always do that. There's a good argument for a whole body of research, maybe in an art context, that takes that on more fully. The difficulty, I think, is, I suppose in both of these contexts, is, again, the lack of research methodologies. It requires something closer to an ethnography, I think, or a kind of a very grounded materialist reading of what happens when you sit down with somebody that you're engaging with through Skype and what have you, to track all of the various permutations of that communicative process. And that doesn't go on so much in our field. And again, this goes back to the limitations of research and art history and criticism. So that's not really an answer to your question. I guess you're absolutely right. There's a division there, and I don't have a good reason for why I don't write about those practices, other than that I found them. You know what it is? Because I think I've been driven by the fact that so little of the work that's been done on participatory practice in an art history context actually pays attention to what happens between people, that I've been very kind of focused on that and haven't stepped back to deal with, oh, well, there's other ways of interacting, and that's another set of protocols. So that's just a blind spot, I suppose, in my own research.
Well, there's always time. Does anyone else have a question? I'm very conscious that we're limited with how much longer you can be with us, and it looks like it's beautiful weather there as well, which is very frustrating. Can we just have very brief questions? Just two more. I saw your hands go up first.
Hi, my name's Rajni. I'm a practitioner, and I guess the thing that I'm looking at in the context of this symposium is I'm interested in the relationship between friendship and critical distance, and this idea that the area of friendship is slippery and dangerous, but that also it's a big part of collaborative practices or practices that happen in the social sphere. And I just wondered if you had anything that you might say in response to that.
Yeah, that's, I mean, there's a whole body of theory from Derrida on that raises questions about the nature of, conviviality and friendship. And as one would imagine, looks at just how fundamentally ambivalent friendship is. The friend becomes enemy very easily and so on. Those kind of slippery relationships. Or Levinas is another good example, right? Levinas is so concerned that anytime you relate to an other, you're going to instrumentalize them, that he has to construct a philosophy in which you're not allowed to have any direct contact. He kind of takes the whole Ding an sich, thing in itself, firewalling of Kant, where you can never really know the thing, and applies it to intersubjective relationships in which it's in a way not safe for you to relate to the other, because lurking within us is this instrumentalizing power that will turn the friend into the enemy. And for sure, that's part of human nature. Sometimes you get really bitchy about your friends, or you gossip about them. You see it on Facebook. They're really good kind of anecdotal examples of that. I think that's for sure an important point of tension. I mean, I suppose that's part of what one negotiates in the practice itself. Oh, can you still hear okay?
Still hear you, yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, there's some background noise. I think I can't get too far away from it. What I think is interesting to consider is, again, I don't want to say binary opposition per se, but I think if we accept that as subjects we are always already divided in certain ways over time and within ourselves, even at given moments in time, that our capacity for love and for hate often commingle. I think you can kind of acknowledge that and then be mindful of it in a practice and make that kind of reflective in a practice, and that's okay. In other words, it doesn't invalidate the practice to acknowledge the complexity of human nature in some way. And then I can think of examples of projects where precisely that tension kind of gets worked out at the practical level. The problem is when you go into it with a very naive model of human subjectivity, that's where things become difficult. But I think a lot of the practitioners that I know are quite aware of the tensions that are implicit in the self-other relationship and are pretty good about negotiating those in the practice. So that's not really a very good answer. It's just to say, yeah, you're right. It's built into what one does in this area of practice to be constantly aware of the kind of push and pull and slippage that occurs between the self and the other.
Well, you've given us loads to think about. I'm very conscious that you have very kindly fitted us in today, and we're already massively over time. So what I'm going to do, Grant, is I'm going to take the two questions rapidly, and then if you can respond to them both, because I just know how precious your time is at the moment. So first question is...
Hi, I'm Trish, an artist and PhD researcher, and I'll be very quick. I'm just interested in your sort of definition of the aesthetic as being, it can be bodily, it can be haptic. So how do you square this with the fact that dominant archival forms tend to be material-based in terms of how a project kind of lasts over time and gets transmitted? So what's your view on the afterlife of these kind of projects and practices?
Kind of documentation issue. Oh, Yvonne Rainer did a performance at Judson Church. What is it? It's 20 years later, we'll reenact it. Yeah. They're very different audiences, aren't they? And people often, so I would say that the audience for the documentation and archiving of a project is not necessarily coextensive with the audience, and maybe audience isn't even the right word, for the original project. And in a way, that's okay. I focus on the audience or the participants at the moment of the project's unfolding. But I do that because I think that there is a level of information that occurs in that exchange that one can witness and understand and analyze that's extremely important to preserve. The second I write about it, it's already transcribed into written form and carried away from that. So you don't want to fetishize, the moment of practice too much. At the same time, you want to hold on to what is unique and specific about it. So I don't really subscribe to the idea that, the documentation is just as important as the original object, et cetera, et cetera. For a lot of the works that I look at, the documentation is necessary, but the moment where the most generative insight is being produced is in the initial unfolding of the project. So I think, but if you want to write about the work, if you want to research it after the fact, you've got to have an archive of some kind. It's just going to be an imperfect representation.
Okay, thank you. And then this is the very last question, Grant, and then we'll thank you.
Hi, Grant. It's Jane Trowell from Platform here. Hi. You're probably not aware of this, but we're in a room with mostly female-bodied people on a subject of InDialogue, and I wondered whether any of your research had been into gender and the dialogical form, and if not, maybe we could all talk about that over this weekend.
Yeah, that's a great point. I talk a little bit about the feminist critique of Habermas in conversation pieces for precisely that reason. And I do think that there's a tendency, the kind of conventions of the avant-garde tend to be masculinist in a lot of ways. And this idea of a kind of a radical interiority that is going to, in a way, do battle with a totalizing external force, for me, that's always felt pretty profoundly gendered. And I don't think it's an accident that a lot of the most interesting work has been produced by women practitioners, certainly, in the work that I've looked at, or by collaborative groups that are composed of men and women or couples and so on. So I haven't really made that like a centerpiece of my research, although I've touched on it at certain points, but I think it's a really important point. And it's something I want to think about. I'm glad you mentioned it. It's something I want to think about in the book I'm working on now. And so I don't have a great answer to that other than to say absolutely. And I think that's something that I want to consider more deeply myself in the stuff that I'm working on now, because I haven't really thematized it overtly in my current book, and I think I should pay some more attention to it. So thank you for that, Jane.
Thank you, Grant, ever so much for giving your time so generously. And I know you've given us double what we agreed that you'd be able to squeeze into your day. So thank you. And I guess that in terms of InDialogue and what this symposium's trying to do, and what's so wonderful in that you're supporting us by framing the next few days for us, I guess it comes back to that idea around the nature of collective thought. And is it that we want to see something, not only that we want to talk about it? Tonight we've started to talk about dialogue. And now I think the rest of the weekend ahead provides us with the opportunity to see how those thoughts that hopefully we've started to have or to scribble down or to share, but how those words become actualized, how they become verbalized through our body, through the performances, through the workshops, through the discussions that we're going to have. And thank you ever so much for joining us and for planting those niggles, as I like to call them, in our minds as we start InDialogue officially tomorrow morning. So can I ask everybody here, please, to give Grant a round of applause, and thank you ever so much, Grant.
Sorry I couldn't be there. I told Rihanna we've got a new baby at home, so it's been really hard for me to travel. So
2016.
a life or death kind of way. Feels poignant. Anecdotal, yes. Outside the studio, yes. On a lunch break, not part of the work. Personal, yes. But also, no. That's the work. The work is in the husk sometimes. You can eat what's inside. That's the productive bit. But sometimes the work is in the husk.
When the sharks come, they might bite. If they open one of the bodies, there will be blood. If there is blood, we all get out of the water. Even going with the flow has rules. The rules are built in. The tide, the moon, the reef, all connected. We too are different. Our same words mean a different thing. Where is the word that always bears just the one meaning? How far to the horizon and which way is it? Walk in any direction, and as we discovered yesterday, we will still get there. It's just a matter of time. The sea rises and swells and then falls. The waves arrive to the shore in series of 7 and 11. The end of the series announces it with the largest wave. It took hours to verify this fact by counting. Now it is never forgotten. You were there with me at the beach, in the water and on the rocky edge, with the tide pools, which hold and reveal creatures of the sea, who hide but find their hiding place has a season which lasts a few hours, and the passing of it happens more than once in a day. The sea slug delivers his entrails to a predator and then works on generating new entrails. By lunchtime, there is the possibility of eating again.